This is the Soviet Death Star. It's a space station equipped with a powerful laser cannon that was designed for war in Earth orbit. Not science fiction, not a movie prop, a real weapon system, 95 metric tons of metal and machinery, built to destroy American satellites and shift the balance of nuclear terror. Now, putting weapons in space might be a hot topic today, but the idea is nothing new. This all played out before in the 1980s, and that means we have a good opportunity here to learn something from our own past. Let's talk about Star Wars. No, not that Star Wars. The real-life Star Wars was a space-based missile defense system championed by U.S. President Ronald Reagan. The idea was that the Americans would place a network of interceptor satellites into orbit around Earth. These space weapons would detect ballistic missile launches from the Soviet Union and destroy them on their way up. This would essentially render the Soviet nuclear weapons arsenal useless. That was a pretty bold proposition for the time, and an extremely dangerous one. For decades, the only thing preventing World War III was mutually assured destruction. If one side launched nukes, the other side would launch nukes, and everyone would die. It was a grim equation, but it kept the peace. Reagan's Star Wars threatened to break that balance. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of all this, Soviet engineers had already begun work on a Death Star of their own, a massive orbital battle station designed to hunt and destroy American interceptor satellites before they could threaten Soviet missiles. This is the story of Polyus, originally called Skiff, a spacecraft so ambitious and so secret that when it finally launched in 1987, it was disguised as a harmless space station. But what happened during that launch became one of the most spectacular and ironic failures in the history of spaceflight. A failure caused by a computer that literally didn't know which way was up. Before we dive into the Death Star itself, we need to understand the context. And that context is built on lies, secrecy, and weaponization masquerading as cooperation. Throughout the 1970s, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union had actually been getting a lot better. We went from the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s, which nearly annihilated civilization as we know it, to a period of apparent diplomacy and cooperation. Although looks can be deceiving. So keep that in mind as we work our way through this web of political lies. There was probably no better symbol of Cold War unity between East and West than the Apollo-Soyuz mission of 1975. The entire world watched as an American spacecraft and a Soviet spacecraft met up in orbit and docked together. It was a historic moment broadcast live across both nations. What followed was 2 days of the first-ever international hangout in space. The crews worked on scientific experiments together. They exchanged gifts, shared meals, and even listened to each other's music. American astronauts drifted through Soviet modules. Soviet cosmonauts floated into American capsules. Handshakes in zero gravity. Toasts with specially designed space drinks. On the surface, it looked like everyone was getting along great. The Cold War seemed to be thawing. Peace was possible. What the world didn't know was that just 1 year prior, in 1974, the Soviets had actually launched a secret military space station into orbit. And it was equipped with a machine gun. The station was called Salyut 3, officially described as a civilian research laboratory. But in reality, it was Almaz, a military reconnaissance platform designed to spy on the United States and NATO forces from orbit. And mounted to the hull was a Reiter R-23 automatic cannon, a 23mm gun torn directly off a Tu-22 bomber and bolted to the side of the space station. Not only did they launch the first gun into space, they also fired the first gun in space. Now, this wasn't any kind of advanced space weapons platform. Not yet. All they really did was tear a gun off a military aircraft and bolt it to a small space station. It wasn't even attached to a mechanism that would let you aim the gun. The entire space station had to be pointed in the direction they wanted to shoot. On January 24, 1975, just months before the Apollo-Soyuz handshake, cosmonauts aboard Salyut 3 aimed the entire station at a target in orbit and fired the cannon. It was only test-fired a couple of times, mostly for fear that the recoil from the gun would tear a hole in the wall of the spacecraft, and everyone inside would be killed. The shock waves from firing could crack welds, vibrations could damage sensitive equipment, and if a shell fragment punctured the hull, rapid decompression would be catastrophic. But the test was successful. The gun worked. The station survived. The Soviets now knew they could put weapons in space, fire them, and keep the crew alive. This was proof of concept, a stepping stone toward something far more ambitious. While American and Soviet leaders shook hands on television and spoke of peace, Soviet military planners were already preparing for war in orbit. The machine gun in space was primitive, but it demonstrated intent. The Soviets were willing to militarize space if necessary. And soon, they would have a reason that seemed absolutely necessary. Because in 1980, everything changed. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected as the 40th President of the United States. And once he took power, Reagan didn't waste much time making big changes. We typically refer to this period as Reaganomics, an economic policy emphasizing tax cuts, deregulation, and increased military spending. But Reagan's most dramatic policy shift came in the realm of nuclear strategy. Reagan represented a sharp break from the détente of the 1970s. He called the Soviet Union the evil empire in speeches. He openly stated that the policy of mutually assured destruction was morally bankrupt. Why should humanity's survival depend on the threat of total annihilation? Reagan believed in peace through strength, not peace through terror. And he had a radical idea for how to achieve it. On March 23, 1983, President Reagan addressed the nation from the Oval Office and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. The plan was ambitious to the point of fantasy. Create a comprehensive missile defense shield using space-based weapons. Satellites equipped with lasers, particle beams, and kinetic interceptors would orbit Earth, constantly scanning for missile launches. If the Soviet Union ever launched a nuclear attack, these space weapons would destroy the missiles during their boost phase while they were still accelerating upward, vulnerable and slow. The media immediately nicknamed it Star Wars. SDI would work in layers. Layer 1, boost phase. Destroy missiles immediately after launch using space-based lasers or ground-based directed energy weapons. This is when missiles are most vulnerable. They're moving slowly. Their rocket plumes are bright and easy to detect, and they haven't released any decoys yet. Layer 2, mid-course phase. Intercept warheads and decoys in space using kinetic kill vehicles, essentially guided missiles that ram into targets at high speed. Layer 3, terminal phase. Stop any warheads that made it through using ground-based interceptors near target cities. If it worked, SDI would render Soviet ICBMs obsolete. The nuclear balance would collapse. America would be invulnerable, and the Soviet Union would be defenseless. Here's the critical question. Was Star Wars real, or was it a bluff? The answer is complicated. The technology Reagan described, space-based lasers powerful enough to destroy missiles, computers fast enough to coordinate thousands of interceptors, sensors accurate enough to distinguish warheads from decoys, didn't exist in 1983. Some of it still doesn't exist today. Many scientists, including prominent physicists and engineers, publicly stated that SDI was technically impossible with current technology. The American Physical Society concluded that even with unlimited funding, a comprehensive missile defense system was decades away at minimum. Or at least, they acted as if they believed it. Soviet leadership saw SDI as an existential threat. If the Americans achieved even partial success, the nuclear balance would shift dramatically. And the Soviet response was to take Reagan's bluff seriously and raise the stakes with an even more extreme countermove. If America was going to put weapons in space to destroy Soviet missiles, then the Soviet Union would put weapons in space to destroy American satellites. The project was called SCIF, and it would become the most ambitious military space program in history. The United States was bluffing with Star Wars, or at least wildly overselling what was technically feasible. But the Soviets bought the threat wholesale and responded with a weapon system that was, if anything, even more ambitious and impractical. The response was SCIF, named after the Scythians, an ancient nomadic warrior people known for their fierce military prowess. If that naming choice tells you anything, it's that the Soviets weren't thinking about peaceful space exploration. SCIF had one purpose: destroy American interceptor satellites before they could threaten Soviet ballistic missiles. The logic was straightforward. If SDI became operational, Soviet nuclear deterrence would collapse. But if the Soviets could destroy SDI satellites as soon as they were deployed, the system would be useless. Reagan's Star Wars would fail before it ever fired a shot. SCIF was designed as a hunter-killer satellite, an orbital battle station that could maneuver to intercept enemy spacecraft and eliminate them with directed energy weapons. This wasn't a small satellite. SCIF was enormous. Length, 40 meters, 131 feet, about the length of a space shuttle orbiter mass, 95 metric tons, 209,000 pounds, heavier than any space station module ever launched. Design, cylindrical body, with a large docking module at one end and a weapons bay at the other. For comparison, the International Space Station's largest module, Zvezda, weighs just 19 metric tons. SCIF was 5 times heavier. At the heart of SCIF was a weapon that sounded like science fiction, but was entirely real. A 1 megawatt carbon dioxide gas laser. 1 megawatt. To put that in perspective, a typical laser pointer is about 5 milliwatts, 1/200,000th the power. Industrial cutting lasers used to slice through steel are typically 5 to 10 kilowatts. SCIF's laser was 100 to 200 times more powerful than that. This wasn't a weapon designed to dazzle or blind sensors. This was a weapon designed to burn through satellite hulls, fry electronics, and physically destroy targets in orbit. Lasers have several advantages for space warfare. 1. Speed of light. Targeting. A laser beam travels at 300,000 kilometers per second. There's no travel time, no trajectory calculation, no leading the target. Point and fire. The beam arrives instantly. 2. Unlimited ammunition. As long as you have electrical power, you can fire a laser indefinitely. No need to carry kinetic projectiles or explosive warheads. 3. Precision. Lasers can focus energy on extremely small target areas, critical components like solar panels, antenna, or sensor arrays. 4. No debris. Unlike kinetic weapons that shatter targets into clouds of dangerous orbital debris, a laser can disable satellites without creating fragments that threaten other spacecraft. But building a megawatt-class laser that works in space presented enormous challenges. The laser system alone weighed over 17 metric tons and required massive amounts of electrical power, far more than any spacecraft had ever generated. We'll get into the technical details of how this laser worked in the next chapter. But first, we need to talk about how they plan to get this monster into orbit. Because launching 95 tons of military hardware into space required a rocket unlike anything the world had ever seen. Let's talk about how you build a laser powerful enough to destroy satellites from hundreds of kilometers away. LASER stands for Light Amplification by Stimulated Emission of Radiation. In simple terms, a laser is a device that produces a highly concentrated beam of light. Photons all traveling in the same direction, at the same wavelength, in perfect synchronization. Regular light, like from a light bulb or the sun, spreads out in all directions and contains many different wavelengths. A laser beam stays tightly focused over long distances and delivers concentrated energy to a small point. Skeef's weapon was a carbon dioxide (CO2) gas laser, a type of laser that uses a mixture of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and helium gases to generate the beam. Here's how it works. Step 1. Excitation. An electrical discharge passes through the gas mixture, exciting the nitrogen molecules. Excited nitrogen molecules vibrate at high energy levels. Step 2. Energy transfer. The excited nitrogen molecules collide with CO2 molecules, transferring energy to them. This puts the CO2 molecules into an excited state. Step 3. Photon emission. When the excited CO2 molecules return to their normal state, they release photons, particles of light. These photons have a wavelength of 10.6 micrometers, which is in the infrared spectrum, invisible to the human eye. Step 4. Amplification. The laser cavity contains mirrors at both ends. Photons bounce back and forth between these mirrors, stimulating more CO2 molecules to release more photons. This creates an avalanche effect, rapidly amplifying the light. Step 5. Output. One mirror is partially transparent. When the light intensity reaches a certain threshold, a portion of the laser beam escapes through this mirror as the output beam. CO2 lasers have several advantages. 1. High efficiency. They convert electrical energy into laser light more efficiently than most other laser types, typically 10 to 20% efficiency compared to 1 to 3% for many solid-state lasers. 2. High power. CO2 lasers can achieve very high output power levels, megawatts in military applications. 3. Good beam quality. The beam can be focused to a small spot over long distances, essential for hitting targets hundreds of kilometers away. But building a megawatt-class laser for space created unprecedented challenges. Problem 1. Waste heat. Even at 20% efficiency, 80% of the input energy becomes waste heat. For a 1 megawatt output, that means 4 megawatts of waste heat that has to be removed. In space, where there's no air for convective cooling, heat removal is extraordinarily difficult. Solution: massive radiator panels to radiate heat into space as infrared radiation. Problem 2. Electrical power. Generating 5 megawatts of electrical power. 1 gigawatt for the laser, 44 lost as heat, requires enormous solar arrays or a nuclear reactor. Skeef planned to use a combination of large solar panels and possibly a compact nuclear power source. Problem 3. Optics. The laser beam had to be focused and aimed using precision mirrors and lenses. Any imperfection or thermal distortion would scatter the beam, reducing its effectiveness. Solution: adaptive optic systems that could adjust mirror shapes in real time to maintain beam quality. Problem 4. Targeting. Hitting a moving satellite from hundreds of kilometers away requires incredibly precise pointing and tracking systems. The laser had to lock onto targets, compensate for orbital motion, and hold the beam on target long enough to cause damage. Solution: advanced tracking sensors and computer-controlled pointing mechanisms. The complete weapon system aboard SCIF included the CO2 laser generator, 17 metric tons. Power supply systems, cooling radiators, targeting sensors and tracking systems, beam director, mirrors and pointing mechanisms, fire control computers. All of this had to work flawlessly in the harsh environment of space. Extreme temperature swings, vacuum, radiation, and micrometeoroids. Here's the crucial question. Was this laser system ever tested and proven functional? The answer is complicated. Ground-based prototypes of high-power CO2 lasers existed and worked. The Soviet Union had tested megawatt-class lasers for anti-satellite research as early as the 1970s, firing them at targets from ground installations. But space is different. Integrating all these systems into a functional spacecraft, generating enough power, managing the heat, and operating reliably in orbit was an entirely different challenge. As we'll see, the Soviets never got the chance to find out if it would work. Because before Skif ever reached orbit, politics intervened. To launch the massive Skif orbital battle station, the Soviets needed a rocket more powerful than anything they'd ever built. The solution was Energia, one of the most capable heavy-lift launch vehicles ever created. Energia was a monster. Height, 60 meters, 197 feet, tall, about the height of a 20-story building mass at liftoff, over 2,400 metric tons, 5.3 million pounds. Thrust, 35 million newtons, 7.8 million pounds force at liftoff payload capacity. Over 100 metric tons to low Earth orbit. For comparison, the American Space Shuttle could lift about 27 metric tons to orbit. Energia could lift nearly 4 times that much. Energia used a side-mounted payload configuration. Unlike American rockets, which typically place the payload on top of the rocket stack, Energia attached large payloads to the side of the central core stage. This design offered advantages. No need for an expensive fairing to protect the payload during ascent. The ability to launch payloads larger in diameter than the rocket itself. Easier integration and testing. The payload could be prepared separately and attached shortly before launch. The core stage was powered by 4 RD-0120U engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. 4 strap-on boosters, each with a single RD-170 engine burning kerosene and liquid oxygen, provided additional thrust at liftoff. Skif was designed specifically to be launched by Energia. At 95 metric tons, no other Soviet rocket could lift it. Even the mighty Proton rocket, the Soviets' workhorse heavy lifter, could only manage about 20 metric tons to low orbit. But there was a problem with mounting something as large and heavy as Skif to the side of Energia. Aerodynamics. During ascent through the atmosphere, the asymmetric shape created severe aerodynamic loads. The rocket had to fight against the drag and pressure from having such a massive payload hanging off one side. The solution? Mount Skif upside down. By inverting the spacecraft, placing its heavy end near the rocket's base and its lighter end near the top, the designers could balance the mass distribution and reduce aerodynamic stresses. This seemed like a clever engineering solution. But as we'll see, it set the stage for disaster. While engineers worked frantically to finish Skif, the political landscape in the Soviet Union was shifting dramatically. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party, effectively the leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was younger, more pragmatic, and more willing to question Soviet orthodoxy than his predecessors, and he quickly recognized several uncomfortable truths. 1. The Soviet economy was collapsing. Decades of centralized planning, military overspending, and economic stagnation had left the USSR on the brink of bankruptcy. Consumer goods were scarce. Industrial output was declining. The standard of living was falling behind the West. 2. The arms race was bankrupting the country. The Soviet Union was spending an estimated 15 to 20% of its entire GDP on military programs, compared to about 6% for the United States. This was unsustainable. Projects like SCIF, which cost billions of rubles and diverted resources from desperately needed civilian industries, were part of the problem. 3. Star Wars was probably a bluff. Soviet intelligence analysts increasingly believed that Reagan's SDI program was mostly propaganda, technically impossible with current technology and unlikely to be fully funded by the U.S. Congress. If SDI wasn't a real threat, then spending billions on SCIF to counter it was wasteful paranoia. Gorbachev introduced two radical policies: perestroika, restructuring, economic reforms to introduce market mechanisms and reduce central planning, glasnost, openness, greater transparency, freedom of speech, and reduced censorship. These policies were designed to save the Soviet system by modernizing it. But they also meant questioning Cold War assumptions and reducing military adventurism. By 1986, SCIF was nearly complete. The spacecraft had been built. The Energia rocket was ready. Launch facilities at Baikonur Cosmodrome were prepared. But Gorbachev saw SCIF as everything wrong with Soviet policy. Provocative. Putting a laser-armed battle station in orbit would escalate tensions with the West. Expensive. Billions of rubles that could be spent on civilian needs. Unnecessary. Based on overreaction to an American bluff, Gorbachev wanted to stand down from the Cold War, not escalate it into space. But he faced resistance. Military hardliners and the defense industry demanded that SCIF proceed. Canceling the program would mean admitting weakness and wasting years of work. Gorbachev reached a compromise. SCIF would launch, but only after being dramatically de-escalated. The decision was made to remove the weapon systems and disguise the spacecraft as a civilian research platform. The process of neutering SCIF happened in stages, each one representing a retreat from the original ambitious and provocative design. Stage 1. The 1-megawatt laser is removed. The first casualty was the main weapon system itself. The 1-megawatt CO2 laser proved far more complex and troublesome than anticipated. Ground tests revealed problems. The cooling system couldn't adequately remove waste heat in simulated space conditions. Power requirements exceeded what the spacecraft's solar arrays could provide. The beam director had precision problems. The mirrors couldn't maintain focus over long periods. The entire system was too heavy and took up too much internal volume. Rather than delay the program further for redesigns, the decision was made to remove the laser entirely. Stage 2. SCIF becomes SCIF-D. With the main laser gone, engineers proposed a fallback: mount a smaller, lower-power laser as a proof of concept. The redesigned spacecraft was designated SCIF-D, D for demonstrator. This version would carry a smaller laser, perhaps 100 kilowatt class instead of 1 megawatt, a functional targeting and tracking system, the same orbital maneuvering capability, reduced power requirements and cooling needs. SCIF-D would prove that laser weapons in space were feasible, even if the first version wasn't fully operational. But political pressure continued to mount. Even a demonstration laser battle station was too provocative for Gorbachev's new policy of détente. Stage 3. Polyus, the civilian disguise. The final transformation was radical: remove all weapons systems and rebrand the spacecraft as a civilian research platform. The spacecraft was renamed Polyus, meaning pole in Russian, ostensibly because it would orbit over Earth's poles and study polar regions. The official cover story: Polyus was a scientific space station. It would conduct research on Earth's magnetosphere and radiation environment. It would test advanced life support and docking systems for future space stations. It had no military applications whatsoever. To sell this fiction, they even painted the exterior white and added civilian markings. What remained, despite the weapons being removed, Polyus retained several capabilities that revealed its military origins. 1. Powerful orbital maneuvering system. The spacecraft had large fuel tanks and high-thrust engines, allowing it to change orbits and intercept other satellites. This capability made no sense for a stationary research platform. 2. Sophisticated sensors. Targeting and tracking systems remained aboard, ostensibly for docking tests, but clearly designed for identifying and locking onto other spacecraft. 3. Large internal volume. The weapons bay remained, now empty, but providing space that could be filled with equipment on future missions. 4. Hardened systems, radiation shielding, redundant computers, and robust communications suggested a military platform, not a civilian research station. U.S. intelligence agencies watched the Polyus program with suspicion. Satellite reconnaissance of the Baikonur Cosmodrome showed the enormous spacecraft being prepared for launch. The CIA and National Reconnaissance Office noted its size, its attachment to the powerful Energia rocket, and its suspicious resemblance to earlier skiff designs leaked through intelligence sources. The official American position was skeptical, but not overtly confrontational. If the Soviets wanted to launch a research station that looked suspiciously like a battle station, the U.S. would watch closely and prepare countermeasures. But nobody, Soviet or American, anticipated what would happen on launch day. May 15, 1987. Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan. Launch day. The massive Energia rocket stands on the pad, its white exterior gleaming in the morning sun. Attached to its side, mounted upside down, is Polyus, the renamed, disarmed, supposedly civilian version of the Soviet Death Star. Polyus is mounted inverted to improve aerodynamics during launch. The heavy engine end is near the rocket's base. The lighter end is near the top. This balances the load and reduces stress on the rocket's structure as it accelerates through the atmosphere. The plan for reaching orbit involves a complex sequence. Step 1. Energia's boosters ignite. The rocket lifts off and ascends through the atmosphere. Step 2. After the boosters and core stage burn out, Energia separates from Polyus, leaving the spacecraft in a suborbital trajectory, not quite fast enough to stay in orbit. Step 3. Polyus fires its own main engine to circularize the orbit and reach operational altitude. But there's a problem. Polyus's main engine is pointing the wrong direction. Because the spacecraft is mounted upside down, when it separates from Energia, its engine points toward space, opposite the direction needed to boost into orbit. The solution is a 180-degree flip maneuver after separation. Step 1. Polyus separates from Energia while inverted. Step 2. Small thrusters fire to rotate the spacecraft 180 degrees, flipping it right side up. Step 3. Once correctly oriented, the main engine fires to boost into orbit. This maneuver had to be executed perfectly. Too much rotation, and Polyus would overshoot the correct orientation. Too little, and the engine would fire at the wrong angle. And here's the critical detail. The guidance computer controlling this maneuver was a repurposed unit from the Soyuz spacecraft program. Soyuz spacecraft always launch right side up, with their engines pointing down toward Earth. The guidance computer's programming was designed around this assumption. Engineers adapted the Soyuz computer for Polyus by reprogramming the flip sequence. But they didn't, or couldn't, fully account for the computer's built-in assumptions about which way was up. At 9:30 p.m. local time, Energia's engines ignite. The rocket lifts off flawlessly, accelerating rapidly through the atmosphere. 8 minutes later, The core stage burns out and separates. Pollius is now flying free, inverted, on a suborbital path. The guidance computer activates. It consults its internal sensors, gyroscopes, and accelerometers to determine the spacecraft's orientation. And it freaks out. The computer recognizes that Pollius is upside down. According to its programming, this is wrong. Spacecraft should be right side up. So it initiates the flip maneuver, firing thrusters to rotate Pollius 180 degrees into what it thinks is the correct orientation. The spacecraft flips. So far, so good. Pollius is now right side up, with its main engine pointing in the direction of travel, exactly where it needs to be to boost into orbit. But the computer checks its sensors again. It sees that the orientation has changed. And because of lingering bugs in the reprogrammed software, it interprets this as an error. The computer thinks, I commanded a flip to correct the orientation, but now the orientation is different than expected. I must have made a mistake. I need to flip back. So it fires the thrusters again, rotating Pollius another 180 degrees. Now the spacecraft is inverted again, with its main engine pointing directly toward Earth. The computer, satisfied that it has corrected the orientation problem, proceeds to the next step. Fire the main engine. The engine ignites at full thrust, hundreds of kilonewtons of force pushing Pollius toward Earth instead of into orbit. For approximately 7 seconds, the engine burns, accelerating Pollius downward and slowing its orbital velocity. Then the computer realizes something is catastrophically wrong and shuts down the engine. But it's too late. Pollius's velocity is now too low to achieve orbit. Instead of climbing to 300 kilometers altitude, the spacecraft is falling. Pollius never achieved orbit. Approximately 10 minutes after launch, the massive spacecraft re-entered Earth's atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean. At 95 metric tons, Pollius was one of the largest objects ever to re-enter the atmosphere. The friction of re-entry heated its aluminum hull to thousands of degrees. The structure broke apart, creating a spectacular fireball visible for hundreds of kilometers. Debris impacted the ocean, scattered across a wide area. Some pieces sank immediately. Others floated briefly before being swallowed by the waves. The Soviet Death Star was dead. Soviet media didn't report the failure immediately. The official story, when it finally emerged, was vague. An experimental spacecraft experienced a malfunction and did not reach the intended orbit. Western intelligence agencies, which had monitored the launch, pieced together what happened through radar tracking and signals intelligence. The U.S. knew Pollius had failed, but the exact cause remained classified for years. It wasn't until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the full story emerged. Russian engineers, no longer bound by Soviet secrecy, revealed the details. The inverted launch, the confused guidance computer, the double flip, the engine burn toward Earth. The failure had multiple root causes. 1. Schedule pressure. Pollius was rushed to launch to meet political deadlines. More time for testing and software validation could have caught the guidance error. 2. Reused systems. The Soyuz guidance computer wasn't designed for inverted launches. Adapting it was cheaper than designing a new system, but introduced bugs. 3. Complexity. The flip maneuver was inherently risky. Simpler designs, like launching right side up with a more powerful rocket, would have been more reliable. 4. Lack of testing. Pollius never had a test flight. It was a one-shot mission. There was no opportunity to discover problems before the real launch. Pollius's failure symbolizes the futility of the space arms race. The U.S. proposed Star Wars, a system that was technically impossible at the time, The Soviets responded with Skiff, an even more ambitious system that was also impossible. Political pressure forced both sides to scale back their ambitions. When Polyus finally launched as a neutered shadow of Skiff, it failed due to a software bug, billions of dollars and rubles spent, years of engineering work, all ending in a fireball over the Pacific. The story of Polyus should be a cautionary tale. Space weaponization is expensive, destabilizing, and prone to failure. But history is repeating itself. In recent years, space has once again become a military frontier. The United States established the Space Force in 2019, a dedicated military branch for space operations. China has tested anti-satellite weapons and demonstrated the ability to destroy spacecraft in orbit. Russia continues to develop anti-satellite systems and inspector satellites that can approach and potentially disable other spacecraft. Multiple nations are developing directed energy weapons, including lasers similar to those planned for Skiff. In 2024, former President Donald Trump proposed a Golden Dome missile defense system, essentially a revival of Reagan's Star Wars concept. The technology is better now. The lasers are more powerful. The guidance systems are more sophisticated. But the fundamental dynamics remain the same. An arms race in space creates instability, drives massive spending, and risks escalating conflicts into domains where there are no winners. What should we learn from the story of the Soviet Death Star? 1. Bluffs have consequences. Reagan's Star Wars was largely a bluff, technically unfeasible and underfunded, but the Soviets took it seriously and spent billions responding. Bluffing in superpower competition can trigger real responses with real costs. 2. Complexity kills. Polyus failed not because of its laser or its engine, but because of a software bug in a repurposed computer. In complex systems, the smallest components can cause catastrophic failures. 3. Schedule pressure is dangerous. Rushing to meet political deadlines means cutting corners on testing and validation. Polyus might have succeeded if engineers had more time to debug the guidance system. 4. Space weaponization is wasteful. Both Star Wars and Skiff Polyus consumed enormous resources for systems that either didn't work or were never completed. Those billions could have been spent on healthcare, education, infrastructure, or genuine scientific exploration. 5. The arms race benefits. No one, the US and USSR, spent the 1980s trying to outdo each other in space weapons development. Both countries would have been better off if neither had started. Today, pieces of Polyus sit at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, corroded by salt water and covered in sediment. Nobody will ever recover them. There's no memorial, no plaque, no museum exhibit. The Energia rocket that launched Polyus flew only twice. Once with Polyus, once with the Soviet space shuttle Buran. After the USSR collapsed and funding dried up, the Energia program was cancelled. The launch pads at Baikonur still stand, but they'll never fire another Energia. The engineers who designed Skiff and Polyus are mostly retired or dead. A few have given interviews describing the project with a mixture of pride in their technical achievements and sadness at its ultimate failure and waste. The Soviet Death Star was real. Engineers built it, politicians funded it, and the most powerful rocket ever designed by the Soviet Union launched it toward the stars. But it never reached orbit. It never fired its laser. It never proved that weapons in space could work. Instead, it proved that space weaponization is dangerous, expensive, and prone to catastrophic failure. As we stand on the threshold of a new space arms race, with new technologies and new political tensions, the story of Polyus whispers a warning from the past. Don't make the same mistake twice. I want to end by acknowledging something important. The engineers who designed Polyeus weren't villains. They were brilliant scientists and technicians doing their jobs in a system that demanded they build weapons. The mathematics of orbital mechanics, the physics of gas lasers, the engineering of spacecraft systems, all of this required genuine genius. The people who designed the CO2 laser, who calculated the flip maneuver, who programmed the guidance computer, they were solving incredibly difficult technical problems. In another timeline, those same brilliant minds might have designed space telescopes, planetary probes, or systems to benefit humanity rather than threaten it. In a 1997 interview, one of the Polyeus engineers, who requested anonymity, reflected on the project. "We knew we were building a weapon. We knew it was part of the arms race. But we also believed we were defending our country. The Americans had Star Wars. We needed something to counter it. Looking back now, I see how foolish it all was. Star Wars didn't work. Our laser didn't work. We spent billions of rubles we didn't have, and in the end, a stupid software bug destroyed everything. But I'm still proud of what we built. Not because it was a weapon, but because it was impossible, and we almost made it work. That's engineering. You take an impossible problem and you solve it. I just wish we'd been solving problems that helped people instead of threatening them. Strip away the politics and the military purpose, and Polyeus remains an impressive engineering accomplishment. A 95 metric ton spacecraft, one of the largest ever built, an orbital maneuvering system powerful enough to change orbits and intercept targets. A megawatt-class laser system, in the original design, integration with the Energia rocket, one of the most capable launch vehicles in history. The fact that it failed doesn't diminish the engineering skill required to build it. It just reminds us that engineering brilliance can be wasted on destructive purposes. Imagine if the resources spent on Skiff Polyeus had been directed toward peaceful space exploration. A space telescope 40 meters long with a massive mirror, an interplanetary probe with enough fuel to visit multiple planets, a true orbital research station conducting experiments to benefit humanity, a lunar or Mars mission with the heavy lift capability of Energia. The engineers who built Polyeus were capable of any of these achievements. The technology was there, the talent was there, the funding was there, but the political will demanded weapons instead of science. On May 15, 1987, Polyeus fell from the sky and shattered into pieces over the Pacific Ocean. The Soviet Death Star died not in glorious battle, but in confused failure, brought down by a computer that didn't know which way was up. It's a fitting metaphor for the space arms race itself. Ambitious, expensive, technically sophisticated, and ultimately pointless. The engineers did their jobs brilliantly. The politicians failed catastrophically. And the lesson remains. Space should be a place of discovery and exploration, not a battlefield for Earth's conflicts. Because the next time someone builds a Death Star, and they will try, it might actually work. And that's when the real nightmare begins. While Polyeus failed, the Energia rocket that launched it was a triumph. Both of Energia's flights were technically successful. The rocket performed flawlessly. It was the payloads that failed. Energia's specifications were extraordinary. Payload capacity, 100+ metric tons to low Earth orbit, reusable core stage, designed to be recovered and refurbished. Modular design allowing different numbers of boosters, capability to launch from the side mount position or with a payload on top. For comparison, NASA's Space Launch System, SLS, the most powerful rocket currently operational, can lift about 95 metric tons to LEO. Energia could do that in 1987. After only 2 flights, the program was cancelled. the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, ending government funding. The Russian economy went into crisis through the 1990s. There were no payloads large enough to justify the cost of Energia launches. The program had been closely tied to Soviet military ambitions, making it politically toxic. The infrastructure still exists at Baikonur. The launch pads have been partially dismantled. Some Energia components are displayed in museums. A few boosters were converted for use with the Zenit rocket program. The main engines, RD-0120, influenced later engine designs. Could Energia fly again? Technically, yes. The designs exist. Russian engineers still have the knowledge. But economically and politically, it's extremely unlikely. Building new Energia rockets would cost billions. There's no pressing need for such heavy lift capability. Modern alternatives like SpaceX's Starship may soon exceed Energia's capabilities. Russia's space budget has contracted significantly since the Soviet era. So, Energia remains a magnificent achievement that flew twice, proved itself capable, and was then abandoned for reasons having nothing to do with its technical merit. The tragedy of Polyus isn't just that it failed, it's that it wasted the incredible capability of Energia on a destructive weapon that never worked. If Polyus had been a space station, a telescope, or a deep space probe, we might remember Energia as the rocket that opened a new era of space exploration, the Soviet equivalent of the Saturn V. Instead, we remember it as the rocket that launched a Death Star that promptly fell into the ocean. In that same 1997 interview, the anonymous Polyus engineer said, "Sometimes I dream about what we could have done if we'd had different orders. With Energia and a properly designed payload, we could have built a rotating space station with artificial gravity. We could have sent a massive probe to Jupiter with years of fuel for exploring its moons. We could have established a permanent base on the moon. Instead, we built a laser to shoot American satellites, and it didn't even make it to orbit. That's the real tragedy of the Cold War. Not that we lost. Everyone lost. We wasted our talents on destruction when we could have built wonders.